On a spring afternoon, little Lila sat drawing hearts with purple chalk in the backyard. Just minutes later, the yard stood empty, quiet as if her laughter had never filled the air. While her mother searched in panic and officers tried to piece together clues, a German shepherd named Toby lowered his head to a pink jacket, then began to walk, slow, steady, as though something unseen was calling him forward. Somewhere in the wind, a sound too soft for human ears was waiting, and Toby was the one who heard it. Afternoons in Millersfield moved like a springtime stream, gentle, sun-drenched, and slow enough to remember every glint of light. The town was only a few blocks wide, the kind of place where everyone knew the neighbor's cat by name, and where folks still recalled who first planted tulips at the start of March. Small flags fluttered quietly from front porches, and the faint hum of a lawnmower from the far end of the street wrapped the moment in a familiar warmth, like an old quilt washed in rainwater and left out in the sun. In the brick-paved yard behind a pale yellow house, a 6-year-old girl was drawing with chalk. Lila sat cross-legged, her tiny hand holding a piece of purple chalk, carefully outlining loops of what she called her magic heart. Scattered nearby were squiggly letters that read like "Childhood Secrets, I Love Mom," alongside a stick figure drawing with 2 upright ears. Her version of Toby the German shepherd she'd seen once at the town market and had adored from the very first glance. Inside the house, Joanna, Lila's mother, stood in the kitchen cradling her 8-month-old son. Every now and then she glanced through the window quietly, watching the small figure of her daughter under the porch light. A breeze stirred loosening cherry blossom petals from the branches above. They floated down into Lila's hair, turning the moment into a living spring painting already framed by memory. And then, that painting cracked. Joanna looked out again just as the baby in her arms quieted with a soft sigh. She smiled, about to call Lila in for a snack, but the yard was empty. The purple chalk still lay on the bricks, the heart unfinished. No footsteps, no voice. Just a silence so sharp it sliced through the air as if a gust of wind had taken the child away. She froze for a breathless second, then bolted out the door. Her voice called Lila's name, at first softly, then with rising panic. The garden gate was still closed, the fence untouched. The neighbors saw nothing, only pieces of chalk scattered like forgotten thoughts. At 3:58 p.m., the phone rang at the Millersfield police station. Tom had just pulled on his jacket, ready to take Toby out for an eastern perimeter check. He answered the call, and Joanna's voice came through broken by tears. Only 3 words made it through clearly: "Lila is gone." No one expected this in Millersfield, a town that looked like it had been glued together from scrapbook memories. But Tom knew bad things didn't care where they happened. He nodded at the 2 officers on shift, then knelt beside Toby, the K-9 partner who had been by his side for 3 solid years. Toby wasn't just any dog. His dense, dark double coat made him look like he belonged to mountaintops. And he had. Before joining the Millersfield K-9 unit, Toby worked search and rescue across the Bitterroot Range in the far north, where winter could swallow entire roads and lives vanished in silence after a single wrong step. Toby had been trained to detect the faintest breath, to notice shifts in the air that most wouldn't feel, and to find life in places where all hope had been buried. But Tom always believed Toby's gift went beyond training. There was something deeper, quieter, a soul tuned to hear what humans so often missed. The tremble of fear, the whisper of danger, the smallest clue that something wasn't right. The truck sped away from the station, heading toward Joanna's home. In the back seat, Toby stood alert, ears raised, gaze fixed out the window, as though he already sensed something the rest of them couldn't. When they arrived, Joanna rushed from the porch, her infant still in her arms, still in his soiled diaper. Her face was pale, her voice shaking. She was just here, drawing hearts. Tom stepped closer, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. I'll find her, Joanna. But I need something of Lila's. Something she wore or held today. She vanished into the house like a gust of wind and returned with a small pink jacket, still carrying the scent of a child's sweat and buttery cookies. Tom crouched, holding the fabric out. Toby sniffed it with focus, then turned nose close to the ground and began moving. Steady, silent, deliberate. Tom followed closely, eyes never leaving the dog. In the background, a television jingle floated from a neighbor's rooftop, and far away, the trees rustled with wind. But for Tom, it all faded when Toby stopped, staring toward the back of the yard. There, tucked behind the garden, stood an old metal shed, its door half obscured by a row of withered potted plants. Toby approached slowly, ears high, nose brushing the rusted edge of the door. A soft whine escaped him as his paw scraped gently at the wood frame. Then he froze, completely still, as though listening for something just beneath the surface of silence. Tom leaned in. "What is it, buddy?" But Toby didn't look at him. His eyes locked on the shed. His tail stiffened. His back legs bent slightly. And then, just faintly, a whimper. So soft it could have been the wind. But Toby heard it. Tom's gut tightened, not because of the sound, but because of the silence before it. That unnatural hush had started the moment Lila vanished. He knew in his bones what waited beyond that door wouldn't be empty. He eased the door open and stepped into the shed. The air hit him instantly, damp, thick with mildew and the metallic tang of rusting tools. The room was dark, lit only by faint streaks of sun piercing gaps in the warped planks. Joanna had told him her late husband used it as a garden shed, but no one had entered it in years. Tom dropped to one knee, flashlight sweeping the corners. No footprints, no strange fabric, no signs of forced entry, just stillness. He'd seen crime scenes left in a hurry. Scattered shoes, dropped masks, a misplaced print. But this, too clean, too still. It crawled over the skin. Toby padded in quietly behind him, head-low steps, measured like he feared disturbing something sacred. His ears locked upright, paws whispering against the floor, gauging distance between life and fear. Every breath he took seemed heavier now, as though the weight of what he sensed pressed down on him. Tom gave the first command. "Toby, search." The dog stopped. He didn't react as he usually did. No burst of urgency, no immediate action like in other cases. He simply stood still, tilting his head slightly to the right, eyes fixed on the old wooden floor at the far end of the shed. Then, without warning, Toby leaned forward, placed one paw on the ground, scratched once at the floorboards, and stepped back, waiting. Tom moved in, crouching low, flashlight sweeping close to the surface. There were no cracks, no signs of a hidden door. Yet Toby's gaze remained locked on a single spot. The fifth plank from the entrance dead center. "What are you seeing?" Buddy Tom whispered. Not really expecting an answer from anyone but the dog. No voice responded. But something in the silence began to speak. Not through barking, not through sound, but through the weight of stillness, the kind that made Tom feel something was wrong right beneath their feet. He stepped back out and called for another officer this time, asking for tools to pry the wood up. While waiting, he looked back at Toby. The dog still stood there, one paw resting lightly on the same spot as if anchoring it, as if afraid whatever was beneath might vanish the moment he looked away. Minutes later, the two men worked together, lifting the planks one by one. Beneath the floor was no basement, no trap door. Just a crawl space, narrow and low, barely half a meter tall. A small ventilation pipe protruded from the side wall, recently installed, still clean with visible fingerprints. And at the far end, when Tom's flashlight swept across, a shape emerged. Small, curled. A pink jacket, a bowed head, arms wrapped around what looked like a stuffed animal. "Lila!" Joanna choked on her breath when the radio crackled with Tom's voice. She bolted through the back door only to collapse to her knees as she saw her daughter being carried out. Face streaked with dirt, eyelids shut tight, lips moving softly in a whisper no one could hear. The child didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply trembled ever so slightly like a leaf touched by a silent storm. Tom held her in both arms as he stepped into the sunlight. Toby walked beside him, steady, each paw step firm, careful. At the porch, Lila was laid down on a makeshift stretcher. The medics moved quickly, checking vitals before lifting her into the ambulance. Joanna clung to her daughter, whispering 100 questions the little girl couldn't answer, just buried her face into her mother's chest. When the ambulance pulled away, Tom sat down next to Toby. His breath remained heavy, not from the sprint, but from something heavier that had pressed against his chest for the past half hour, part relief, part unease. He stroked Toby's thick fur, the same coat that once braved snow and wind. "You found her even when I saw nothing. You heard something, didn't you?" Toby looked at him. Those deep brown eyes, still wide, calm like water at dawn. He didn't react with triumph or tail-wagging joy. He simply stayed, like a breathing stone, as if guarding some fragile note still lingering in the air, not yet ready to fade. Across the yard, another officer spotted faint tire marks near the back fence, thin treads from a light delivery truck. The tracks pointed back toward the pine forest. No human footprints. It seemed whoever had left Lila there had vanished before anyone even noticed. Tom took notes, but the question echoed in his head over and over. Why had Lila been placed there in a space so hidden, with no signs of struggle, no sounds, no witnesses? More importantly, why had Toby reacted not to a command, but to something deeper, something far beyond any training he'd ever received? Evening fell over Millersfield like a dark shawl. The cherry blossom petals were still falling, just as they had that morning. But now the silence carried a different weight. It no longer meant peace. It felt like a veil stretched over something waiting in the shadows. Something only those who knew how to truly listen would ever detect. Toby stood once more at the edge of the shed. His ears were alert, gaze fixed deep into the growing dark beneath the floorboards. And from behind him, Tom watched quietly, as though he too was beginning to learn the art of listening. Tom's flashlight swept slowly beneath the newly exposed floor. The air below was thick, holding the damp scent of time left untouched. Dust floated in from the narrow ventilation shaft, spinning like a pale mist through the stale space, as though a hidden world breathed differently down here. A world without sound, without motion. The crawl space hadn't appeared on the original house plans. Tom had checked the blueprints the moment he returned from the hospital. That section of flooring, behind the shed, was never listed. It was a hidden compartment just under 4 meters long, crudely reinforced with planks lined with strips of old fabric along the base. No lighting, no wiring. But a fresh air duct led straight into the underbrush beyond the yard, just enough for someone to create a hiding place. When the last board came loose, a puff of thick dust hit his face. Tom crouched lower, squinting to see deeper into the darkness. In the far corner, just where the beam of his light barely reached, he saw her. Lila was curled tightly against the earthen wall. Her pink jacket was stained with dust, crusted with dry soil and tiny grit. In her arms, she clutched a stuffed bunny, off-white, its ears floppy, one eye dangling from a frayed thread. Her head was tilted, as if she had drifted into a sleep too long to measure. But her lips still moved faintly, whispering something no one could yet understand. Tom knelt down and steadied his voice. "Lila, can you hear me?" She didn't answer. Then Toby came forward. He stopped right at the edge, eyes fixed on the narrow chamber. No barking, no scratching, just silence. And then, Toby dipped his head, pressing slowly into the gap, easing his body through paw by paw, making himself small enough to approach without fear. Tom almost called him back, but stopped, because what he saw next stole the breath from his lungs. Toby leaned in and gently pressed his forehead to Lila's. Not abruptly, not like a command, but like something instinctual, something wordless and sacred. It was a gesture so subtle, so intimate, it felt like wind brushing across a wheat field, soft but real. And in that moment, just that moment, Lila trembled. A faint sound escaped the girl's throat. It wasn't a cry, nor a call. It was more like a breath, finally being released, as though her small chest had dared to exhale for the first time after hours of being locked in silence. Tom gently crawled in. His hand reached out, touching her back softly. "I'm here, Lila. Let's get you out of here." She didn't open her eyes, didn't move much, but her hands tightened around the stuffed bunny, and her head gave a subtle nod. With help from a paramedic, Tom carried Lila out of the crawl space. Light poured in from outside, and she winced. Not because of the sun, but because of the noise. After hours in a world where breath was the only sound, everything now felt loud. Joanna dropped to her knees the moment she saw her daughter. She wrapped her arms around the girl, tears running down her cheeks. "Sweetheart, baby, I'm here now." Toby stood nearby, his coat covered in dust, the tip of his nose still clinging to grains of dirt. He didn't move, didn't bark. He just sat quietly watching the reunion, as though he were still holding onto a thread of life, until he was certain the child was safe. The medics worked quickly. Lila's heartbeat was weak but steady. No major injuries, just dehydration and exhaustion. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, her hand never let go of the stuffed bunny, and her eyes only opened when Toby came close. Their gazes met. She blinked slowly, and then a fragile smile, barely there like the curl of wind on water, appeared on her lips. Tom watched, heart caught somewhere between awe and dread. The girl was alive. But why had she been hidden there? Who put her inside, and how had a 6-year-old endured hours in complete stillness without a single sound, except one that only Toby had heard? As the ambulance drove away, carrying Joanna and Lila into the fading light, Tom turned to look back at the shed. The floorboards had been pulled aside, the crawl space left open like a wound in the earth. And Toby, still standing in that exact spot, stared into the old dust as if memories were still lingering there. Something had happened in that place. Something precise, quiet, and undeniably intentional. And Tom knew this was only the beginning. Night fell softly over Millersfield, but inside the town hospital, peace remained out of reach. The room where Lila rested was tucked at the end of the second-floor hallway. The window stood half open, letting the curtains sway gently with each rotation of the ceiling fan. The lights were dim and warm, and the quiet was so deep you could hear the soft clicks of a nurse's pen behind the reception desk. Lila lay still in the bed, her head resting on a thin pillow, her eyes open but gazing far beyond the walls, as if watching something invisible across a distant place. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. There were no whimpers, no outbursts, no flinches like those often seen in trauma-struck children. Instead, there was silence. A silence so dense and unwavering that it troubled the doctors more than any scream ever could. 3 days had passed since she was found beneath the floor. Joanna hadn't left her side, not for a single night. Each morning she whispered into her daughter's ear. Gentle encouragements, fairy tales, the same lullabies they once sang together. But Lila didn't respond. No nod, no shake, no flicker of reaction to anything, except the way her eyes followed the swaying willow branches just outside the window like pale pencil strokes drawn across a gray sky. Tom came to the hospital every evening after his shift. But he never entered the room. He stayed behind the glass pane watching quietly. Something about that door kept him back, a feeling of helplessness he rarely experienced. Over the years he'd faced violence, bloodshed, loss. But it was this silence, the kind that lived inside a child, that made him feel small. He had rescued her, and yet it didn't feel like enough. He brought little things, new stuffed animals, comic books, cookies shaped like stars. But Joanna always shook her head gently. She doesn't care for any of it, Tom. It's like she's still stuck somewhere I can't reach. Tom sat in the hallway, eyes fixed on the speckled floor tiles. A while later, Joanna stepped out, her face pale, her voice hollow like someone who had cried past the point of tears. I know you did everything you could. As a mother, I feel useless. I hold her, but I can't make her speak. Tom looked up, and in that moment, a thought passed through him. Toby. He remembered the way the dog had pressed his forehead gently against Lila's back in the shed. He remembered the girl's eyes when they looked at Toby. That was the only time her face had changed. A brief flicker, a thread of connection stretched between two hearts, without words. The next afternoon, Tom brought Toby to the hospital. The pediatric wing had strict rules, but with the K-9 service credentials, Toby was allowed in. He walked beside Tom, steady, silent, observing every nurse, every child wheeled past. There was something soft about the way he moved, as if he knew this was a place where the air itself needed gentleness. Lila's room was slightly ajar. Joanna sat reading by the window. The girl still lay still, eyes cast toward the outside branches. Tom crouched by the door and whispered, "Someone's here to see you." Toby stepped forward slowly. He stopped just short of the bed, about 2 steps away. He didn't leap up, didn't inch too close. He simply sat down, quiet and calm. Lila turned her head. Her gaze landed on his upright ears, then moved to the deep brown in his eyes. A moment of stillness passed, and then, for the first time in 3 days, her hands loosened from the bunny, and slowly she reached out as if offering a gesture, a question. Toby inched forward. He tilted his head gently and rested his chin on the edge of the bed, close to her arm but not touching, just near enough to be present. Joanna stood abruptly. She brought her hand to her mouth. Tom placed a hand on her shoulder to steady her, or perhaps to steady himself. And then Lila spoke. A whisper so soft it floated through the air like a thread of breath. "You really heard me, didn't you?" The room froze. In that moment, Tom felt the world slow to a hush. He looked at Lila, then at Toby, who remained motionless, as if he had become part of the hospital bed, part of the air, part of the fragile life that had just been stirred awake. Lila closed her eyes. A thin line of tears slipped from the edge of her long, dry lashes. "I kept calling, but no one heard. Only you." Toby shifted slightly. He rested his head gently on the girl's arm, as if confirming her words, a silent nod in a language most humans never quite learn in time. Joanna broke into tears. Tom turned away, his throat tightening. That evening, Lila managed her first few spoonfuls of porridge. Her voice was faint, brief, but she began to accept the return of sound into her world. And each time Toby came close, she would whisper something meant only for him. Words that lived in a realm where silence and understanding met halfway. Later that night, Tom stood on the hospital balcony. The evening wind touched his collar. Beside him, Toby lay stretched out, head resting on Tom's boot. He gently ran a hand along the dog's back and murmured, "Saving someone isn't just pulling them out of danger. It's bringing them back to themselves." Toby didn't lift his head, but his tail gave a single quiet wag. By midday, sunlight blanketed the rooftops of Millersfield like soft silk. But for Tom, the weather carried no meaning. He stood in Joanna's backyard, eyes moving slowly across the shrubs, the stone path, the flower pots, now brittle with summer heat. Toby was beside him, but clearly uneasy. Pacing in a repeated path, nose nearly grazing the ground, occasionally lifting his head as if chasing the scent of something not yet formed. The rescue of Lila had ended with an embrace in the hospital hallway and a grateful glance from Joanna. But Tom felt a lingering dissonance, like a melody cut short before its crescendo. His instincts told him something was off. More than that, he trusted Toby, the dog who never wagged without purpose. "There's something else here, isn't there?" Tom crouched beside him, locking eyes with those alert ears. Toby didn't respond the usual way. He inhaled deeply, then suddenly turned and veered off toward the back end of the yard, toward the sagging wooden fence long weathered by years of wind and rain. Tom followed. That fence bordered a patch of unused land, untouched for years. Near an overgrown oak, Toby stopped. He scraped the ground once with a front paw, then paused. His eyes locked on the grass beneath. Tom dropped to his knees. Beneath the thin layer of weeds, a scrap of fabric the size of a child's palm emerged. Using tweezers, he lifted it, brought it to his nose, and frowned. Industrial soap. The sharp, sterile kind used in hospital laundries or industrial camps. The fabric itself was soft, like water-resistant outerwear. On the edge, a smudge of gray clay stuck, completely different from the local red soil. Toby was still staring at him, those eyes asking what words couldn't. "Do you see it now?" Tom slipped the fabric into a zip bag, rose to his feet, and looked beyond the fence. From here, a tall adult could easily lift a child, cut through the bushes, enter the shed, and vanish without a trace. He walked next door and knocked. A middle-aged woman answered. It was Helen, Joanna's longtime neighbor. "Ma'am," Tom asked quickly, "did you have your outdoor security camera on last week?" She nodded. "I always keep it running, for the raccoons." "Did something happen?" "Officer." Minutes later, they sat in her living room scrubbing through the footage from the day of the incident. The timestamp ticked forward until Tom paused the screen. A white cargo van, small, battered with long scrapes along the side. It appeared at exactly 3:46 p.m., 10 minutes before Joanna noticed Lila's disappearance. One detail caught his attention immediately: the van had no plates. The camera caught the front angle, but the license area was blocked by a piece of black cardboard. Tom clenched his jaw. This wasn't spontaneous. Whoever did this planned it carefully. They knew the schedule, the layout of the garden, even the camera placements. Helen gasped. "Dear God, you mean they've been here before?" He nodded slowly, and they watched for a long time. Tom left with a growing list in his mind. The fabric, the industrial scent, the unmarked white van, and Toby's eyes. Ever since leaving the hospital, they had remained fixed on that direction, as if he too knew the last missing piece was still somewhere nearby. Back at the station, Tom sent the fabric in for fiber and chemical analysis. At the same time, he requested a list of white vans without plates reported in the Millersfield area over the past 3 months. But one thing circled in his mind. This wasn't the first time the person had done something like this. That evening, Tom took Toby to the rear lot behind the station. The night was crisp, the streetlights casting warm orange halos across the ground. Toby lay beside him again, head on his boot, eyes half closed as if listening to something deep underground. "You know something, don't you, old friend?" Tom said softly. "This feels different." Toby didn't answer, but his tail moved once, slow and low. Then his eyes opened, turning toward the woods, where even now headlights sometimes flickered through the trees. That gaze, it wasn't just alert, it was a warning. And Tom understood. The investigation wasn't over. The next morning, a wide map covered Tom's desk at the precinct. Red circles marked each report of a missing child across neighboring towns. They had escaped media attention, spread across months too scattered to notice. But now, paired with the clues from Lila's case, they formed a pattern, like faint claw marks across an otherwise clean wall. The first name flagged in the suspect file, Caleb Miles. He once lived in Millersfield 5 years ago. He'd been arrested for secretly filming children in a supermarket, but the evidence hadn't been strong enough to press charges. He vanished soon after. Recently, someone reported spotting a man, matching his description, driving a small white cargo van near the northern woods, close to an abandoned cluster of cabins left from a time no one remembered. Tom ran the vehicle records again. Caleb's name no longer appeared in any official database, but a recent shipment log from a small gas station near the northern woods bore his signature just a few weeks prior. The puzzle pieces were beginning to align. That same afternoon, Tom set out with Toby and 2 fellow officers heading straight into the forest. The trail was rough, tangled with wild roots and knee-high weeds. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the pine canopy like threads of gold slicing through the underbrush with the quiet sharpness of a blade. The air was thick, heavy with dampness, each breath tinged by the scent of rot and old bark. After more than an hour of navigating through the terrain, they found it. A narrow wooden cabin, half buried against a slope cloaked in undergrowth and crumbling stone. It looked ready to collapse. The roof sagged to one side, the door warped, and swollen windows sealed over with cardboard and faded plastic bags. But what made Tom halt wasn't the decay. It was Toby. The dog let out a low growl, barely audible, his body sinking low to the ground, ears, sharp tail stiff. Step by step, he moved toward the cabin with the posture of a tracker who had found something he didn't like. Tom raised his hand, signaling silence. He approached the door, nudged it open. It groaned like something old and brittle finally breaking its own silence. Inside the cabin was cold and still. The furnishings were sparse, a chair with a broken leg, a dust-covered table, and a few empty water bottles stacked in the corner. But what drew Tom's eye was the filthy rug in the center, slightly off-center, just enough to reveal a metal latch beneath. He yanked it open. The wood gave way, exposing a narrow staircase that descended into the earth. The air below was thick, suffocating. The flashlight beam swept across the underground space. Plain concrete walls soundproofed the floor tiled in outdated square ceramics. And yet the room's shape froze Tom in place. It was a near replica of the crawl space where Lila had been held. Same proportions, same suffocating size. No windows. Just a small ventilation pipe in the far corner, identical to the setup beneath Joanna's shed. But worse than the eerie familiarity was the notebook resting on the table. Tom picked it up. The first few pages were a mess of scribbles, formulas, figures. But in the middle, a list. Emma L., 7, Auburn, Caitlin R., 6, Waterton, Isabel M., 8, Stone Creek, Lila H., 6, Millersfield. Lila's name had been crossed out in red ink. Next to it, one word, noise, failed. Tom felt his chest tighten. Below the list were more names. Some crossed out in thick black marker, like aborted plans. Others marked with dates, phone numbers, and location notes. He brought the pages closer, reading each line as if etching it into memory. He tracked them, all of them. Made notes. Recreated the rooms like a dream looping over itself. Toby entered behind him, sniffed the far corner. He let out a faint growl, then looked at Tom. Clear, deliberate someone had been here. By the time they emerged from the cabin, the sun was already lowering behind the trees. Tom stood on the slope looking out toward Millersfield, feeling like he was holding a secret no one else could yet see. Inside him, something had ignited. Caleb had been planning this for a long time. He wasn't working alone. And if Lila had been rescued, then the others, the names on that list, could still be trapped somewhere inside identical spaces built to replay the same nightmare waiting to be found. Morning had just broken when Joanna stepped out the back door to take out the trash. Dew still clung to the grass. The first rays of light spilled gently through the willow branches, casting a soft glow over the garden she knew by heart. But today, something didn't belong. It made her stop cold on the porch, breath catching in her throat. Near the old wooden fence, right beside the young oak tree Lila had once planted, lay a photograph. Joanna stepped forward, her hands trembling as she bent down to pick it up. It was a printed color photo bordered in white, the paper thin, clearly from a digital camera. In the image, Lila was staring blankly at the lens, wearing her familiar pink dress. Her eyes were wide open, but empty. The photo was cropped tight around her face, as if to magnify the helplessness. Below the image, written in garish red ink, a single sentence sprawled, "Heard her last time." "Try hearing this," Joanna screamed. Tom and Toby arrived 10 minutes later, lights flashing. Joanna was still shaking, gripping the photo so tightly the edges were curled. She didn't look away from it, afraid that blinking might let it vanish, and something worse would replace it. Tom examined the image. His expression hardened. He came back. Not to take someone, to send a message. Joanna looked at him, her lips pale. What does he want to taunt us, threaten us, or tell us it's not over? Tom was silent for a long beat. All of that. But more than anything, he wants me to know. He wants Toby to know. Toby had already begun sniffing around the garden, his movements slow, focused. As if even the dust held secrets, whispering in a language only his kind could translate. He lowered his nose to the earth, then suddenly lifted it again, scenting the air, pointing straight toward the old fence. Tom followed. His eyes scanned each wooden slat, every blade of trampled grass, and there it was, just as he feared, a fresh footprint embedded in the damp soil. A man's boot print, worn tread on one side. It matched the pattern found near the forest cabin. He crouched to take a cast of the print, then looked to Toby. "See anything else, buddy?" Toby didn't wait for the command. He veered around the back trail, squeezing through the broken part of the fence, leading them into the thicket beyond. Tom followed. Both of them moved without a sound, two trackers chasing a presence that wasn't visible but breathing near. Toby stopped near a large tree. Beneath it lay another scrap of fabric, dark-colored, neatly folded, like it had been dropped but not forgotten. Tom picked it up. This time the scent wasn't soap. It was photographic chemicals. His face tightened. He's printing the photos himself. He brought a camera here, might still be nearby. The wind stirred the tall grass. The sun had risen higher, but its warmth hadn't yet reached the ground. The chill remained. Tom clenched the photo. That red ink message, "Try hearing this," wasn't random. It was a provocation, a lure, a challenge. And someone had just accepted it. But what chilled Tom more than anything was the silence. Not just the absence of sound, but the deliberate stillness in Caleb's methods. No noise, no rash moves. Every trace was left just enough to be found, but not enough to follow. As if his presence itself was a message, a whisper cast from the shadows. That night, Tom increased security around Joanna's home. 2 officers rotated shifts. New cameras were installed overlooking the backyard, and the lighting system was upgraded to automatic motion-activated beams. Joanna locked every window tight. Lila, though never told about the photo, clutched her stuffed bunny all night, her wide eyes staring at the ceiling, unblinking. Toby lay at the back door like a living statue, his ears always turned toward the woods. Tom sat on the porch, eyes searching the dark. He came back. "Toby," he whispered. "He's testing us." Toby didn't move, but Tom knew he was listening. Not just to sound, but to the subtle shifts beneath the earth, the unfamiliar breaths carried by the wind, the faintest tremors of bark and grass. This silence, it was the loudest sound of all. And in that quiet, Tom understood one thing clearly. Caleb wasn't retreating. He was preparing his next move. And next time, it wouldn't be just a photo. Just before midday, Toby stopped suddenly along the western trail outside town. The breeze whispered through the old trees, carrying the scent of moss and fallen leaves. But threading through the air was something different. A scent that made Toby's muscles tense and halt mid-step on a path he walked often. His eyes locked onto a dense thicket nose, lowered each paw step, now drawn forward like pulled by an invisible thread. Tom, a few steps behind, noticed instantly. "What is it, buddy?" he asked, his grip tightening on the lead. Toby didn't respond with his tail, nor his ears. He responded with stillness. His entire frame tautened like a carved figure, motionless, yet thrumming with alert. Then, without waiting for instruction, he veered left, heading deeper into the forest. Tom followed, boots crunching over dry leaves like heavy punctuation. The air grew denser. The canopy filtered sunlight into narrow beams that barely reached the forest floor. Toby stopped beside a low mound, and the scent of blood struck Tom immediately. Sharp, metallic, undeniable. They found the body of a small animal. A groundhog, still warm, but lifeless. It wasn't the death that unsettled Tom. It was the way it had been handled. The belly had been cut, clean fur around the incision, carefully shaved muscle tissues methodically separated. There were no signs of struggle, no tearing, nothing suggesting wild predation. It was too clean, too precise. Tom knelt, slid gloves on, and used the edge of a pen to gently lift the open cavity. There was no blood, as if it had been drained before being sliced. His throat tightened. This wasn't an accident, and it was an instinct. It was a test. Toby stood a few feet back, eyes locked on the carcass. He didn't growl, didn't flinch. But the way his facial muscles drew tight, the way his whole body hovered in silent tension, told Tom everything he needed to know. The smell of blood wasn't pooling on the ground. It didn't rot. It didn't stink. It lingered like a phantom. Something too recent, too unnatural. Tom exhaled slowly, mind reeling. Caleb Miles. The crawl space replica. The list of girls. The color photo dropped in a backyard. And now, a dismembered animal prepared like an autopsy subject. He murmured half to himself, "He's repeating patterns. Starts with structure, then tests. What stage are we at now?" Toby turned and looked at him. A single glance. But it said what no human words could. It's getting closer. Tom logged the location, photographed the scene, and collected the carcass in a forensic evidence bag. Then he radioed the station requesting a crime scene team and forensics to process the site, specifically to test for foreign DNA or shoe prints matching Caleb's. On the way back, Tom fell into silence. The scent of blood Toby had tracked. It wasn't about volume. It was about wrongness. A corpse with no odor, no insects, no fluid seepage. It meant the event had been recent, or it had been staged with deliberate care. In his mind, a sharper image formed. Caleb was testing limits, rehearsing, step by step, as if preparing for another abduction. And this time, it might not be someone new. It might be a replay of Lila. Because the truth about predators like Caleb is this: they don't act once. They repeat. They refine. That night, Tom laid out the photo of the groundhog's body, the cabin's underground room, and the list from the notebook. Scribbled ink marks stared back at him like echoes from the dark. Among them, he circled one line, marked and crossed in red Lila. Failed. Toby sat nearby, eyes half closed but ears turned toward the door. "You feel him," Tom said softly, placing a hand on Toby's back. "The blood you scented today, that was a sign. Nobody dissects an animal just to kill it. He's rebuilding the sensation, the thrill of that first time." Outside wind hissed through the trees like a warning passed between leaves. The house was quiet. But inside Tom's mind, the details began converging into something too structured to ignore. And the man, who turned blood into rehearsal, who used animals as drafts, was moving steadily toward his next target. A new child. Another room. A cycle about to repeat. Toby remained motionless. But when Tom rose to begin drafting his state-level report, the dog suddenly turned to the window. Eyes wide, body stiff, like something unseen had just crept in from the darkness. Morning light pierced the cracks of the abandoned cabin, casting beams across dust that hadn't stirred in years. Tom returned to the site alone, signal scanner in hand. Something about that cabin refused to let go of his mind. It felt like it still held something back. Something they hadn't uncovered the first time. Tom bent low, sweeping his flashlight across the edges of the walls under the broken table along the seams of the cement base. Behind him, Toby followed, not showing the same tension as before. But his ears remained upright, steady, as if tuned to a frequency only he could detect, something faint moving through the sealed air of this underground space. In the corner, right above the vent pipe, Tom spotted an unusual hairline groove etched into the wall. He took out his knife, gently scraping at the flaking cement until it cracked, revealing a small recess just deep enough to fit a human palm. Inside was an old Bluetooth earpiece, scuffed at the corner, matte black blending with the surrounding wall. Tom's pulse surged. He carefully extracted it, sealed it in an evidence bag, and synced it to his receiver. There was one audio file. The date matched exactly, down to the hour, when Lila disappeared. He placed the earpiece in his ear and hit play. It began with a faint hum, like the low buzz of a sealed room. Then came soft, uneven breathing. The kind that sounds like a child trying to stay calm in the dark. And then, Lila's whisper. "I'm here. I'm here." A pause. The breathing quickened. Then a faint creak, like footsteps across old wooden boards directly above. "Can anyone hear me?" Tom's fingers clenched around the earpiece, and then came it. Toby's bark. One singular resonant bark that cut through the silence like a crack of thunder. Then, tiny palms slapping against wood, frantic, desperate. Lila's voice again, this time trembling with sobs. "That dog. He heard me." The audio fractured. Toby's low growl, the scrape of floorboards being pulled aside, and then Lila's cries rising into the air mingled with Toby's rumble, like a sound of confirmation from a soul that had found its missing half. Tom removed the earpiece slowly. His heart pounded, hands shaking just slightly. It wasn't just evidence. It was truth. Two truths placed side by side. One, someone planted that earpiece deliberately. Caleb hadn't forgotten it. He'd left it behind on purpose, to listen. maybe from just 100 meters away, connected to his phone, savoring the panic, the helplessness, the godlike control of hearing a child struggle in silence. 2. Another being had heard. Without tech. Without tools. With instinct. Toby didn't need Bluetooth. He heard the uneven rhythm of breath, the vibration of a heartbeat buried in wood. And he went. Tom looked at Toby now, lying near the wall of the cabin, still as stone. He knelt, placing a hand on the dog's neck. You heard her, when no one else did. And that thought pierced deeper than any piece of evidence, one being listened to torment. Another listened to save. Back at the station, Tom submitted the earpiece and the recording for analysis. The audio was authenticated. Lila's voice confirmed. The creaking matched the floorboards of the cabin. A tech specialist determined the Bluetooth device had a range of roughly 100 meters, which meant, during the moments Lila was trapped, Caleb had been close, very close. A sweep of local electronics stores turned up a purchase of a small recording device paid in cash 3 weeks earlier under a false name. The store's camera showed a blurry figure, tall, thin, wearing a dark jacket, the same silhouette described in another disappearance months ago. Tom returned to his desk and spread everything out. The photo left by the fence, the audio recording the names in the notebook. Under Lila's entry, he added a note, heard, but not by him. She was saved by a soul without malice. That evening, Toby sat outside in the yard, eyes scanning the night as though waiting for a signal only he could detect. Tom joined him, settling beside him on the porch. You chose to listen with instinct, he murmured. He listens with desire. Toby didn't respond. But there was something in his gaze, steady, grounded, that said, if he comes again, I will hear him, and I will go. Only one light glowed on the porch. But within that small circle of brightness, a quiet faith held strong, kept alive by a creature who never spoke yet always listened, as if someone else's heart was beating through his own. Winter wind slithered through the trees, its icy fingers crawling across Millersfield's rooftops, raising goosebumps along Tom's spine. He sat at his desk, staring at the transcript of the recording. In his head, Lila's whisper still echoed, wrapped around that one bark, sharp as a blade cutting through stillness. Beneath the table, Toby slept, or so it seemed. His body was still but not slack. His breathing, steady, ears still angled toward the door, nose twitching every now and then, scanning for something absent from the room but not from the air. Then, Toby jolted upright. No command, no sound. He leapt to his feet, turned to the door, growled low and sharp, then sprang forward like an arrow loosed from a bowstring. Tom was on his feet in seconds, grabbing his flashlight and coat. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. When Toby moved like that, it meant something was happening. Right now. They dashed through the southern woods outside town, usually quiet, unremarkable. The trail was uneven. Moonlight slipped through the canopy, stretching shadows across the damp earth. Tom felt his heartbeat match Toby's stride. Urgent, but not chaotic. Then Toby stopped. In a clearing ahead stood a figure. Caleb Miles, back turned, dragging something heavy. A canvas bag large as a child's body, writhing faintly as if something inside was still fighting for life. Tom's chest clenched. He shouted, "Caleb, stop!" Caleb froze. He turned, pale, gaunt eyes darting like fireflies, then suddenly violently hurled the bag aside like it was useless cargo. Toby lunged for the bundle. Tom reached for his weapon, but before he could aim, Caleb turned and bolted, tall frame slipping through the forest like a ghost swallowed by trees. Tom gave chase, but Caleb's long strides, amplified by panic darkness and uneven terrain, quickly widened the gap. Tom could still hear the erratic crashing of feet through dry twigs, but the sound grew fainter, lost in the pulse of wind and woods. What Caleb didn't know was that Toby had left the canvas bundle behind and was cutting through the forest, guided not by sight but by instinct. He followed Caleb's trajectory using scent wind direction, even the erratic pulse of a panicked heart echoing through the chilled night air. Minutes later, Caleb was intercepted. He stumbled to a halt at the crest of a slick slope. The ground beneath him was wet and unstable, and there waiting at the top of the hill was Toby. He didn't snarl, he didn't bark, he didn't move. He simply stared. That gaze stopped Caleb in his tracks, as if the forest itself had conjured a sentinel. Wide-eyed, motionless, Toby held his ground, with no malice, no growl. Just an unwavering stare that pinned Caleb like a nail into the earth. Tom burst from behind, weapon drawn. But Toby didn't move. No leap. No bite. No violence. No blood. Just that gaze, deep, calm, and colder than the darkness that swallowed the forest around them. Not accusing. Not forgiving. As if looking straight through Caleb's skin and into the place where guilt tries to hide. A single question lived in that silence. You heard them. So why did you still do it? Caleb trembled, took half a step back, and fell. He slipped down the slope, collapsing as if wounded, but no one had touched him. No one had raised a hand. He simply fell, crushed by the weight of that look. By a creature that didn't speak, didn't strike, yet somehow made him collapse under the burden of every voice he had ever silenced. Tom reached him and secured the cuffs. Caleb lay flat, wrists shackled, breath shallow. His eyes were hollow, as though he had just seen something he'd never believed could exist, understanding, from a species he never imagined would defeat him. They returned to the clearing. Inside the bundle was a girl, about 7. Brown hair, dirt on her face, eyes wild with fear. But she was alive. She clutched a torn scrap of cloth. Her lips trembled. Someone heard me. Toby sat beside her. He lowered his head and gently pressed his forehead to her shoulder, just like he had done with Lila. It was a small gesture, but it shattered fear. Warm tears spilled down the girl's cheek like the beginning of something whole. Tom wrapped his arms around them both, Toby and the child, and looked toward the trees. This time no one ran. The morning after the arrest, Millersfield woke like a town slowly stepping out of a bad dream. No sirens, no noise. Just sunlight casting its soft glow on rooftops that had lived too long under the shadow of fear. And now, once again, silence carried a new meaning. Peace. At the station, Caleb Miles sat in an interrogation room, head bowed, wrists red from the cuffs. His eyes looked as if someone had doused him in ice water, and he hadn't yet come back from the shock. He didn't resist, didn't deny anything. For over 2 hours, he said nothing. Until finally, when asked why he returned to Millersfield, Caleb muttered one sentence: because she was still breathing. I wanted to hear it again. The room went still. In another wing of the building, the tech unit was decoding data seized from the cabin. A hidden hard drive behind a loose board, 2 micro SD cards from a rusted drawer. When connected to the system, a flood of files appeared. Photos, video clips, hand-drawn maps, observation logs. Spanning over a year across multiple towns, Millersfield, Auburn, Stone Creek, Hillside. Tom sat at the monitor. The first image made his fists clench. Lila, standing outside her preschool gate in a plum-colored jacket. Taken from a distance. Telephoto lens. A caption beneath it read, "First spotted, March." Routine plays alone after school. Mother distracted with baby. Advantage house backs onto woods. Loose fence. Signal talks to herself often. Draws chalk on bricks. Tom flipped through page after page, his throat tight. Caleb had watched Lila for over 6 months. Every note, every frame was proof of a plan, meticulously calculated. And worse, 5 more children were listed. That same afternoon, officers contacted the families of potential victims. 3 girls, from Stone Creek, Auburn, and Hillside, were placed under protective watch. One, aged 8, reported seeing a skinny man in black standing near the fence, but thought he was just a lost stranger. Each of the children shared key traits: quiet, introverted, living near forest edges, often playing alone. Just like Lila. Just like the girl in the canvas sack, now safe receiving medical care, waiting for formal identification. Toby had returned to the K-9 unit, resting in the training yard. But his eyes still lingered on the line of trees in the distance. As if for him the mission didn't end with an arrest. It ended only when he was certain every forgotten life was seen again. Tom stood in the hospital hallway, watching through the glass as Lila drew. She held a purple crayon, sketching a large circle. Inside was a house. Outside, a dog with pointed ears, a black nose, and eyes wide open, listening to everything. Joanna stood beside her eyes, rimmed red, but soft. "She's not afraid of the dark anymore," she whispered. "Last night she told me, if that dog is outside, then there's nothing inside worth fearing." Tom turned to her. "Toby changed everything." Joanna nodded, voice shaking. He didn't need to speak. Just be there. That evening, the press announced Caleb Miles's arrest. Grainy photos from surveillance cameras showed a pale face, tangled hair, eyes, empty. Headlines flooded the news cycle. But one small article was shared more than any other. It read, "A creature once bound by silence listened when we did not. He acted before humans had time to react. His name is Toby, and he didn't need training to know what was right. He just needed to be trusted." To most, it was the end of a chilling case. For Tom, this wasn't the end of a case. It was the beginning of something else entirely. A new journey, one where threats no longer had shapes, and the enemy could be a shadow beneath a street lamp or a passing glance behind a broken fence. But this time he wouldn't be walking alone, because beside him was always Toby, the one who never spoke, never promised, but always heard more than anyone else. Room 207 sat at the far end of the hospital corridor, where the morning light slipped through the window and spilled softly over the cream-colored carpet. Tiny specks of sunlight danced across the bed sheets and the chalk-colored paint palette that Lila kept beside her pillow, as if it were a doorway through which she could still speak to the world. On the days her voice refused to return. 3 weeks had passed since Toby found her. Her physical wounds had healed, but her voice remained silent, like a bird that had flown far away and hadn't yet found its way home. Joanna stayed by her daughter's side each day. She told stories, whispered memories, placed a gentle hand on Lila's chest whenever nightmares crept in. But all those efforts, though wrapped in love, were only met with silence. Eyes bright, aware, but wordless. Toby was allowed to visit the hospital 3 times a week, and each time he would quietly sit by the edge of the bed. He didn't move, didn't ask for anything. He simply looked at Lila, calm and patient. And Lila, during those quiet afternoons, would always draw. She drew the crawl space door, the dusty tile floor, then the pointed ears, the black nose, and the eyes tilted downward, as if Toby in that moment had been listening to the very heartbeat of the earth. That afternoon, Joanna had just finished making tea when the nurse knocked, smiling gently. "Toby's here." Lila sat up instantly. It was the first time she'd ever reacted like that. She threw off the blanket, adjusted her hair, and when Toby entered, she didn't speak, but her eyes lit up. Toby walked slowly toward her like a familiar guest following a sacred routine. He stopped at the bedside, lay down sideways at the edge of the mattress, and rested his head gently against her arm. Joanna held her breath. The room felt suddenly still. No traffic noise from outside, no footsteps in the hallway. Only the soft rhythm of Lila's breathing syncing with Toby's. Then, from that silence, came a sound. Small, fragile, but unmistakable. Toby was the first to hear me. Joanna turned sharply. Lila wasn't looking at her. She was still looking at Toby, her hand resting on his back. Then she spoke again, clearer this time. When I hit the floor, I was scared he would leave. But he stayed. He heard me. Joanna broke down, tears pouring before she could wipe them away. She leaned over, arms wrapping around her daughter, embracing a miracle that had somehow come home. Lila nestled into her mother's shoulder, lips pressed shut, but her eyes never left the dog lying quietly beside her. Toby closed his eyes. He didn't move, didn't react. But a quiet peace filled the room, one that didn't need words to explain. It was the kind of peace born when a silent creature had fulfilled the greatest task of all, protecting a child's voice when the world had stolen it. Tom arrived 10 minutes later. When he stepped into the room, he saw Joanna wiping tears and Lila sitting up against the pillows, one hand resting softly on Toby's back. She spoke, Joanna whispered. Her first word was Toby. Tom walked over and sat beside the bed. Toby still lay there, eyes closed as if asleep. But Tom knew. He had heard. He had understood. He smiled gently. You missed him a lot, didn't you? Lila nodded, then looked Tom in the eyes. Her voice was still small, but steady, I think. He doesn't hear with his ears. He hears with his heart. Tom bowed his head. His hands clenched silently in his lap. Because in that moment he knew no report, no news segment, no medal could compare to that single sentence from the girl Toby had saved. That night when Joanna tucked Lila into bed, her daughter didn't hold her mother's hand. She held Toby's ear instead, the one that draped gently over the side of the bed. Her tiny fingers, as thin as paper, curled around it with quiet certainty. Will he come back tomorrow? She whispered, barely louder than a breath. Joanna smiled. He'll always come back, if you need him. Toby opened one eye, calm and deep. He didn't bark, didn't wag his tail. He simply stayed, like a marker of something sacred that had returned, a voice, a trust, a connection. That voice hadn't come back through pressure or time. It returned because a dog had sat quietly by her side every day, like a silent promise. And from that moment on, Millersfield had one more story. Not in a file, not on the news, but passed from heart to heart. About a dog who heard the very first call when everyone else was still asleep in silence. The room had been repainted a soft white. High ceilings, warm golden lights stretching into the corners. The walls now bore drawings, skies, rivers, and a dog with pointy ears and a lolling tongue. The room, once a dusty file storage space at Millersfield's Rehabilitation Center, now bore a new name, the Light Room. Tom stood at the doorway, one hand holding Toby's leash, the other a folder. Inside, a team of therapists waited. Child psychologists, a special education teacher, and 2 volunteers who had themselves healed from trauma. The first to speak was Dr. Maria Ng, a behavioral psychologist. I've read the file on Lila, she said, pointing to the last page. But what I want to ask is, what made her speak again? Tom glanced down at Toby, who sat upright, his gaze fixed through the glass at the children playing outside. Him, Tom said. He didn't push, didn't ask, just sat there. And Lila, for some reason, felt heard. Dr. Maria nodded, jotting something down. So she continued, "We don't need to train Toby for this job. He's already doing it. We just hadn't noticed." That meeting marked the beginning of an idea, a program to connect children carrying invisible wounds with creatures that expected nothing in return. No responses, no promises, only presence. Tom shared the plan. "We want to build a program called Silent Paw, a network of emotional support where dogs like Toby are connected to psychological treatment centers. But unlike traditional therapy dogs, we don't train them to perform or obey. We train them to listen." The idea was welcomed warmly. What moved people wasn't the scale, but the simplicity. Not every child is ready to speak, but every dog like Toby can be there quietly waiting, listening, without asking for anything in return. The following week, Tom and Toby were invited to a small trial session, where 3 children in recovery were allowed to spend time with Toby in an open space. Each child had been through something life-changing. One was a car crash survivor. One had been bullied into depression, and one had lost her mother in a house fire. When they entered the room, Toby didn't rush in. He didn't lick faces. He simply sat in a corner, his gaze soft and steady. The 3 children watched him, at first unsure. But within 10 minutes, one of them, a boy named Rory, slowly inched closer. He sat an arm's length away, saying nothing. Toby gently turned his head, laid his chin on the floor, and closed his eyes. No one told Rory what to do, but he mirrored Toby's movements. They lay side by side in stillness. There was no sound, but something unseen began to form. When the session ended, Rory looked up at Tom and asked, "Can I see him again?" He didn't look at me like a doctor. He just waited. From that moment on, Silent Paw officially began. No loud posters, no grand launch, just quiet meetings. 1 child, 1 dog, and a silence just wide enough to hear each other breathe. Toby became the quiet pioneer. He didn't have to do anything except be exactly who he was. And somehow, that made him the perfect bridge between children still too fragile to name their pain and a world still learning how to listen with its heart. One late afternoon after a session ended, Tom and Toby walked past the old park, the one where Lila used to play alone before the day she disappeared. Now she was sitting with her mother on a bench, comic book in hand. When she saw Toby, her arm shot up. "Toby." He turned slowly, stepping toward her. No urgency, no theatrics, just a return, as if he'd never really left. Tom remained at a distance, hands in his coat pockets, watching silently. Maybe it was the first time in a long while he truly believed a program didn't need big models or huge budgets. It could begin with 1 softly lit room, 1 patient heart, and 1 creature who knew how to listen when every other sound had gone quiet. The Millersfield District Court convened on an early February morning with thin mist still clinging to the stone steps and the trees along the path holding their breath like the people walking under them. Unlike the frenzy of media trials, the hearing for Caleb Miles unfolded in silence, tense as a bowstring stretched to its limit. Toby wasn't allowed inside the courtroom, but he remained in the hallway, lying still beside Tom's feet as if he were still on duty. A few people passed and gently touched his head, but Toby didn't respond. His eyes stayed locked on the double doors ahead, the ones Tom was about to walk through. Inside, everything had been carefully prepared. Joanna and Lila sat in the front row beside a counselor from the trauma support unit. A protective screen had been set up, not to separate, but to soften the blow when Caleb's face appeared. And there he was, thin, hollow-eyed hair unkempt over his forehead, hands resting on the table still as rotted wood. When his name was called, no one turned. They had already seen him clearly. through the evidence and the nightmares he left behind. Tom was called to the stand. He wore his police uniform crisp and composed, carrying a sealed evidence pouch. Facing the court, he didn't use heavy words. No dramatic rhetoric. Every sentence was simple truth. And that truth made the air so heavy, no one dared exhale. He spoke about the investigation, the missing person report at Toby's reaction near the shed, the first glimpse of the crawl space and the quiet way Toby led him forward. He described Lila's expressions, frightened eyes, icy fingers, and that first look of gratitude she gave not to a person, but to Toby. Then he held up a Bluetooth earpiece, the key evidence. He said this wasn't left in that cabin by accident. It was planted to listen, to record fear. And then he asked for permission to play the recording aloud in court. No one in that room was prepared for how 1.5 minutes of audio could bring everything to a standstill. At first there was only breath, choppy, uneven, distant, like someone trying to hide from themselves. Then Lila's whisper, so faint that people leaned forward instinctively. "I'm here." A few hands clenched tight, eyes fixed on the table's grain, the click of wood. Then again that voice, "Can anyone hear me?" And then a single bark, sharp, certain. It rang out like a paw striking the floor with purpose, the creak of splintered wood, the soft slap of a small hand. That dog, he heard me. And finally, a low rumbling whine, deep from Toby's throat, a sound like a promise passed silently between two beings who shared no common language yet heard one another better than anyone in the courtroom ever could. When the sound ended, the room stayed frozen. No applause, no one moved. Only damp eyes and a feeling, like they'd just witnessed something sacred. The prosecutor said only one sentence after the recording ended. "Your Honor, some trials need defense. But today, silence has spoken, for the victim and for the most extraordinary witness we have." They never needed to call Toby to the stand. Yet his name appeared in the court records under an unusual designation, Humanitarian Auditory Entity, Nonverbal Response Unit. Even Caleb's defense attorney offered no rebuttal. He simply requested to withdraw any claims based on mental instability, stating his client showed no signs of delusion and had not been coerced into his actions. When the trial concluded, Caleb was escorted away in silence. No shouting, no tears. Yet in every eye that witnessed it, something permanent had been etched. Not a case, but a lesson. Tom stepped out into the hallway. Toby was waiting beneath the awning, the early afternoon sun casting a soft glow along the sturdy line of his back. Tom knelt, unfastened the leash, and gently rubbed the back of his neck. "You did what no other witness could," he whispered. "You made the whole room listen, with their hearts." Toby leaned his head into Tom's shoulder, not barking, barely moving. But his breathing was steady, measured, as if affirming justice doesn't always need an accusation. Sometimes it only takes a whisper, and someone still enough to hear it. More than a week after the trial, the mailbox at Millersfield police station began filling up each morning. At first, a few scattered envelopes arrived, pink-green folded by hand. Then they became stacked in tidy bundles tied with twine resting beside the captain's office door. None addressed to Tom, none sent to the department as a whole. Every single one read, "To Officer Toby, K9 Unit." Toby couldn't read, but he noticed. Every time someone walked in with a fresh envelope, the entire room glanced toward him, admiring, affectionate. He remained in his usual spot, head resting on the rug, ears twitching occasionally when someone said his name. And perhaps in the way he lay quietly and blinked slowly, he was listening, just in his own way. Each evening, Tom sat down and opened the letters one by one. Some were from children's scrawled handwriting next to little drawings of pointy-eared dogs. Others came from adults folded with care like confessions long kept quiet. Some were 3-page journal entries from people with PTSD who wrote that after hearing Toby and Lila's story, they'd begun to open up, just a little. He kept the most touching ones aside. One day, he found a small envelope from Indiana, marked simply in pencil, from Ellie, age 10. Inside was a yellow slip of paper. Just a few lines. I haven't spoken since I was 7. I thought no one wanted to hear me. But yesterday, when my teacher played the recording, I whispered, "Toby," and my mom cried. Tom read the letter 3 times. His eyes paused at the final line, not for its grammar, but for the quiet bravery wrapped in every word. The next morning, he enlarged the letter, framed it in wood, and hung it just above the rug where Toby liked to sleep. Then he pointed up at the frame and murmured, "You hear that, buddy? That little girl? She spoke her first word. Because of you." Toby opened one eye. No big reaction. But in the rhythm of his breathing, there was something softer, slower, as though he'd touched something precious. Something most people go their entire lives without ever hearing. Soon after, the department set aside a small room, a new space called the K9 Letter Room. Inside, the walls were painted in calming hues. Photos of children who'd found healing through therapy hung in simple frames. And in one corner beneath the window stood a small sofa, just the right size for Toby to sit beside any visitor who came by. Within 2 months, the letter count passed 3,000. Some came from Canada, Australia, Japan. Teachers wrote to say they'd started sharing Toby's story in class as a way to teach children about listening. Therapists requested permission to include his image in group sessions. One letter came from a war veteran who admitted he'd cried. For the first time in 12 years of combat, he wrote because a creature without language somehow untied a knot in my chest. Tom read each one aloud to the team. And every time he finished, he looked at Toby as if to say, "You're doing something even we may never manage." Reminding people that healing begins the moment someone feels heard. One weekend afternoon, the therapy center held a small exhibition. Selected letters were displayed in the hallway, each one paired with a note describing the writer's story. In a quiet corner by the window, Ellie's letter was given a place of honor. Beneath it, a caption read, "First whisper after 3 years of silence," made possible by a recording, and a dog who never asked anyone to speak. Joanna and Lila attended the exhibit. Lila talked more now, not loudly, but enough to ask questions, tell stories, even laugh sometimes. She stood in front of Ellie's letter for a long while, then turned to her mother. "I want to write her back," she said. "I'll sign it, Lila," the girl Toby heard first. Joanna smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Then write it. Tonight." That night, Tom drove back to the station with Toby. The sky was deep and dark, scattered with faint stars. Toby lay beside the seat head, resting on Tom's leg. "You know," Tom said softly, "even if no book ever records what we've done somewhere out there, someone's sitting in the quiet, feeling heard, just because you once sat beside a child." Toby breathed gently. No bark, no movement, just presence and silence. The kind from which the greatest things are often born. The morning at Millersfield K9 station began with familiar sounds. The creak of the metal gate footsteps brushing the tiled floor. The scent of fresh coffee mixing with the cold air left over from night. Toby was already in his usual spot, curled up on the gray rug beneath Ellie's framed letter. Today he stayed there longer than usual, resting his head lightly on the edge of the mat. Ears tilted toward the door as if waiting for something or someone to arrive. And it did arrive, in the hands of a young mailman. He handed Tom a neatly folded envelope with a small piece of colored paper taped on the front. Written in crayon were the words, "To Toby, the dog who listens." Tom nodded in thanks, returned to his desk, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside wasn't a letter, but a crayon drawing on stiff A4 paper. The lines were uneven, the colors bold and bright. A child's hand had drawn a dog standing in the middle of a golden field, ears perked up, eyes sparkling, and above it a carefully written line read, "The one who heard me." In the lower right corner was a small signature, "Lila loved Toby." Tom stared at the drawing eyes, lingering on the upright ears, as if he too had just heard something profoundly real. The sketch wasn't perfect. Toby was rounder than usual, his nose too big. But the way Lila had shaded the ears with thick, careful strokes, and the way she had written that single sentence made the entire office fall into a hush when Tom lifted the drawing up. "Did the little girl draw that someone asked?" Tom nodded, voice low and rough. "Lila's thank you gift." He stood, walked over to the main bulletin board, the one covered in maps, shift swaths, and faded memos, and gently removed an old notice. Then he pinned the drawing dead center. "From now on," Tom said, "this will be our new center." A few chuckled quietly. Others nodded slowly. And Toby, as if he understood, stepped forward, stood beneath the board, looked up for a moment, then turned and lay down, just as he always did, his ears standing tall, as if he'd just stepped out of the crayon drawing and settled into real life. That afternoon, Joanna and Lila came by. Lila carried a small bag, entering the station with a mix of nerves and excitement. She looked up at the board, and when she saw her drawing had been hung, her eyes lit up. "You really pinned it up?" Tom crouched to her eye level. "Is there anywhere better for everyone to see it every day?" Lila turned to Toby. He stepped toward her, lowered his head in a gentle bow. "I made your ears big," she whispered, "because that's the part I trust the most." Tom smiled. And he trusts them too. He's never missed a sound that needed hearing. Joanna glanced around the room. Files stacked on desks, keyboards clicking, radios chirping. But in the middle of it all was a splash of color, the one bright patch in a muted world. She placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You just brought something beautiful to this place." From that day on, the drawing became a quiet landmark in the station. Officers paused by it when starting or ending their shifts. Some smiled and walked on. Others stood longer, especially on weary days, just staring at the brown wax ears, thick with color, as if reminded, there is someone here, always listening, even before you speak. A month later, the drawing was chosen as the official emblem of the expanding Silent Paw project. It appeared on brochures on a wooden plaque above the K9 letter room and even on the website's first homepage. The phrase, "The one who heard me," became its official slogan. But to Tom, it was more than a slogan. It was proof. Proof that something profound could begin with nothing more than a pair of oversized ears, a patient heart, and a single moment of quiet presence. That night, Tom sat alone in the dim office. Most of the lights were off, but the drawing still caught the glow from the ceiling lamp hanging quietly above a half-full cup of coffee. Toby lay by his side, head resting on Tom's foot. Tom ran his hand along the dog's back and murmured, "You know, just one picture and somehow the whole team wakes up every day wanting to be better." Toby didn't stir, but his breathing was steady, deep, calm as always, as if every answer had already been given long before the question was asked. If someone was quiet enough to notice a drawing with very big ears, Millersfield woke the next morning with a different feeling. Not loud, not restless, but with something gentle in the air, like the smell of sunlight after a midnight storm. On the chalkboard in front of Town Hall was a hand-lettered message in white, edged with green, "Silent Paw Day. A day to hear what's never been said." It was the first celebration in town history dedicated not to a person, not even a traditional hero, but to a dog who had quietly changed how an entire community understood silence. And that dog, of course, was Toby. Tom hadn't told anyone how much he'd hesitated the week before. Afraid the noise would overwhelm Toby, afraid that applause and camera flashes would bury the very thing Toby offered best, a healing stillness. But then, Dr. Maria, the founder of Silent Paw, had gently said, "Tom, this isn't a day to honor Toby. It's a day for those who were once heard by him to whisper back." The Central Park was adorned with soft bunting and wooden signs bearing notes from children. Along the walkway, letters to Toby had been enlarged into displays. One with Lila's handwriting, one with Ellie's crayon drawing, and one written in shaky lines by an elderly man. That dog didn't bark, but he pulled me back from the edge. Toby arrived in a transport vehicle with a simple, quiet path leading straight to the small wooden stage where the Millersfield mayor stood waiting. No flowers, no red carpet, just clean dirt underfoot. When the door opened, the crowd, children, adults, doctors, teachers, police officers, strangers, fell into a hush. Then someone began to clap, not wildly, not loudly, but steadily, softly, like the heartbeat of a town, remembering the quiet moments that once saved someone's world. Toby stepped down, ears high as always, but he didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Tom. Tom walked slowly beside him, the leash held lightly in one hand, just like on any routine patrol. But this time, there was no gun at his hip, no badge on his chest, only a white shirt with sleeves rolled up and a face calm as morning mist. He understood clearly that today he was not the one leading. It was the being walking beside him. Steady steps, quiet like the heartbeat of those who had once been broken, now slowly healing. On stage, the mayor spoke briefly. "We honor silence, not because it is comfortable, but because within it lie the sounds that only the heart can truly hear. And today we dedicate this moment to the first soul who taught us that truth, Officer Toby." A sea of hands lifted, not to applaud but to rest gently over hearts. From within the crowd came a wave of quiet voices, whispers of gratitude, names of children once lost, and soft trembling thank yous. Tom could hear every distinct whisper, and in that ocean of hushed voices he felt Toby stop, right in the center of the stage, and turn to face the town. He didn't bark, he didn't bow, he didn't wag his tail. He simply stood there, like the closing period to the quietest sentence he'd ever spoken. The rest of the ceremony flowed with gentle activity. Children colored sketches of Toby, adults wrote letters on the spot and slipped them into the whisper box. Some wrote nothing at all. They simply stood before a photo board, fingertips resting lightly on Toby's image, eyes closed, as if they were speaking only to themselves. Joanna and Lila were there too. Lila held a fresh sketchbook. On the first page, a cartoon version of Toby, his ears drawn so large they covered half the paper. She tiptoed to where Toby rested, handed the book to Tom and said, "I'm going to make a comic. Tell everything. Everything I remember, so other kids will know there are dogs who don't need to bark to save someone." Toby looked at her, so softly that even the afternoon breeze seemed to pause. As dusk settled in, the ceremony ended in a wash of golden light. Tom led Toby away from the park, walking down a corridor of townspeople who had quietly made room. No one pushed forward. No one cheered. They simply tilted their heads, a gesture of respect, as if greeting someone who had just returned from a long battle one fought without a single weapon. And Toby, unchanged, kept his eyes only on Tom. Because through the entire journey, no matter how many eyes followed him, how many words praised him, how many gestures honored him, he remained tuned only to the one person who had believed in him from the very beginning. Believed in his ears, his gaze, and the heart that never once turned away from an unspoken cry. That night back in his office, Tom scribbled a few lines on a sheet of paper I used to think a police officer's job was to protect, with weapons with training. But it turns out some lives are saved simply by sitting quietly beside someone who can't speak. Toby wasn't trained to be a hero. He just listened. And maybe this world needs more beings who know how to listen with their whole heart. Since the first Silent Paw Day, Tom began receiving invitations from across the region. Not from formal agencies or professional summits, but from humbler places, a rural elementary school, a shelter for abandoned children, a safe house for domestic abuse survivors. Places with no podiums, no honor rows, just eyes once closed from pain, now cautiously opening, searching for something gentle enough to not scare them shut again. Tom said yes. And he never went alone. Toby has always walked with him. The first visit was to a special class at Rockwell Elementary, designed for students with high anxiety and communication disorders. They'd been told a quiet friend would visit. No need to greet him, no pressure to speak. Toby entered just like that. No bark, no rush. Just walked to the center of the room, lay down, and kept his ears alert to every corner. At first, the children kept their distance. One hid behind a desk, another chewed anxiously at their sleeve. But in the silence, no one tried to fill eyes, began to shift. A girl inched her chair closer. A boy placed a tiny cookie by Toby's paw, then backed away. 10 minutes later, Toby lifted his head gently, licked the treat, then lowered his chin back to the floor, as if offering a thank you that needed no words. Among all the places they visited afterward, one stayed with Tom more than the others. It was a small shelter in a neighboring city, home to children abandoned or removed from families due to abuse. The space was bare gray concrete yard, faded toy cars, and tall iron fences worn down by time. The shelter director greeted Tom with a firm handshake and quiet eyes. "There's a boy here. Jaden, 8 years old. He hasn't spoken since he arrived. But once we caught him staring at a photo of Toby on the wall, as if something inside him recognized something." Tom nodded. "He can meet Toby if he wants, but no one has to force anything." Toby entered the yard. Other kids quickly gathered around, but Jaden stayed in the corner, hidden behind a large, potted plant. He wore a gray hoodie, head down, hands gripping the hem of his shirt. Toby didn't approach. He gave one glance and settled himself in the middle of the yard, just like always, waiting. Time passed. The other children drifted away for snacks. Only Jaden and Toby remained. And then, no one called him, no one guided him. Jaden stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, still gripping his shirt. When he reached Toby, he stopped, didn't blink. His whole body quivered. Toby didn't lift his head. But when Jaden sat down beside him, Toby tilted his nose, gently touching the boy's hand. Jaden exhaled deeply, as if he had just swum through a long, exhausting memory. And then, he wrapped his arms around Toby. Didn't speak, didn't cry, just held on. Like it was the first time in his life someone had accepted him without asking for anything in return. Tom stayed back. No photos, no interference. He knew. Some miracles bloom only in silence. Since that moment, Jaden still hasn't spoken. But he looks people in the eye now. He draws. He places a hand on a classmate's shoulder when they're sad. And every time Toby returns, Jaden is already waiting in the same spot, carrying a small cloth ready to brush the fur from the place he once leaned against, as if honoring a quiet ritual of gratitude. The story spread, but not in a loud, sweeping way. It moved like an underground current, passed quietly from child to child, sketches of Toby, handwritten notes that read, "The dog who listens without asking." I can breathe easier when he's nearby. Or simply, thank you for not asking why I'm quiet. One evening, Tom returned to the center. As he greeted the staff, Jaden approached. Still silent as always, but this time he placed something in Tom's hand, without a word. It was a crayon drawing Toby standing in the center of a dark room, surrounded by little orbs of light like fireflies. On each glowing shape was a child whispering into his ear. At the bottom was a single line, Jaden's first, written by his own hand. The dog saved me, not by shouting but by staying. Tom taped that drawing to the cover of the Silent Paw program file. He understood now history remembers the heroes who thunder through time with guns, horns, and speeches. But there are lives that save others in silence, with eyes that don't judge and ears that open only when every other door has slammed shut. And if someone were to ask Tom what Toby's greatest accomplishment was, he wouldn't mention the courtroom, the commendation letter, or the grand ceremony. He'd simply say, there was once a child who hugged him for a long time, for no reason at all. And maybe that's why. It saved them both. In March, Millersfield began to thaw. The snow melted slowly, leaving damp streaks along the brick paths circling the station. Everything seemed to fall back into its usual rhythm after a long, turbulent winter, except for one thing. Toby was no longer listed on the morning patrol roster. 3 days earlier, Tom had submitted a handwritten request for Toby's retirement. The reason was simple. He's listened to the world long enough. No one objected. Everyone on the team understood. Toby had done far more than any trained canine. He hadn't just sniffed out evidence, detected tubing, or blocked fleeing suspects. He had been the first to hear forgotten sighs. The bridge between silence and recovery. His retirement wasn't because he'd grown weak. It was because what he left behind was already strong enough to keep living, even when he stopped. But on the very first morning after that decision, when Tom opened the door, he found Toby already sitting on the front steps. The air was still cold, but the dog had been up for a while. Ears lifted sharply as if catching familiar sounds. The clink of a belt, the drip of coffee in the kitchen, the twist of a key in a lock. Tom froze. He's on duty. He crouched down, brushing his hand over Toby's head, gently scratching behind the ear, the spot that always made him close his eyes in contentment. Still reporting for duty, Tom asked softly like a ritual. Toby didn't move, but the way he looked at Tom was clearer than any spoken answer. From that day on, every morning was the same. Toby rose early and took his place at the steps even before Tom had pulled on his jacket. There was no leash anymore, no assignments. But he chose the same spot, head resting on the stone step, eyes fixed on the road passing by the station as if waiting for something that needed no name. Tom didn't change his habit either. Each time he stepped past, he'd say, "Heading out, partner." And every evening when he returned, Toby was still there. Not dozing off, not wandering away, just shifting his position enough to watch his longtime friend walk through the doorway. One morning, the rain came early. Tom returned late after a meeting jacket damp and flecked with water. But there Toby was, still lying on the steps, fur on his back, soaked through, head resting on the edge, eyes open. Tom rushed over, throwing a towel over him. "Why didn't you come inside, huh? You're off duty now." Toby exhaled slowly. He didn't shift, didn't back away. But there was something in his gaze that made Tom pause, as if the dog was trying to say, "Retired doesn't mean I've stopped keeping watch." Tom began writing a journal for Toby. Not task logs, but scattered memories. Their first patrol, the time Toby discovered an animal carcass deep in the woods. That courtroom stare Lila's drawing, Jaden's embrace, and all those nameless, quiet mornings. He closed the notebook and labeled the cover with a single line. For the soul who served the longest shift, without a clock. Everyone on the team had their own way of honoring Toby. One officer brought a pillow embroidered with his name placed on the corner of the sofa. Another baked homemade biscuits every week. Some just sat near him saying nothing, resting a hand on his back for a few minutes before walking away. Toby welcomed it all with gentle eyes, as if he understood. These gestures weren't praise, but quiet farewells for someone who hadn't yet left. One afternoon, Lila and Joanna came to visit. The girl had grown taller, her hair longer, her smile a little more open. She carried a small fabric pouch. In it, a hand-knitted wool cap with 2 pointy ears sticking up. "I made this for Toby," she said. "So when it's cold and he's still on duty, he can keep those ears high." Tom laughed and placed the cap on Toby's head. The dog tilted slightly, eyes half-lidded, as if savoring the moment. His first uniform given by a little girl who once could only whisper behind her hands. Joanna snapped a photo. Toby with the knitted ears standing tall, Lila beaming beside him. The picture was shared across the entire Silent Paw network in the state, accompanied by a message: "He's no longer patrolling, but his presence still guards places he's never been." Night fell. Tom opened the back door and stepped onto the porch, a cup of hot tea in hand. Toby was there, resting beneath the awning now, with warm ears beneath the wool cap, eyes closed but not deeply asleep. Tom sat beside him silent for a moment, then whispered, "Maybe you don't need to go out anymore. But I still need to know. When I come home, there's always someone watching." Toby's breathing remained calm. The Millersfield police station was as quiet as always in the deep of night. But by the door, there was still one soul lying in wait. Not for orders, not for glory. Still on duty. Spring had arrived in Millersfield with gentle winds. The bite of winter was gone, though the air still carried a chill that made shoulders hunch as people crossed the sunlit yard. The tree beside Tom's porch was budding again, pale green tips like memories just waking. A sparrow landed on the wooden fence singing small tentative notes, as if it too was learning how to speak again after a season of silence. Tom sat on the wooden chair by the porch, the spot he and Toby had shared every afternoon. Today was no different. Toby lay close by his head, resting gently against the leg of the chair, one ear tilted toward Tom. His eyes not fully open yet, far from inattentive. In Tom's hands was a stack of letters. Not police reports, not bureaucratic paperwork. They were letters from all across the country collected over the past several months. Letters from children who had once hugged Toby, from nurses, from teachers, from a retired soldier in another state, and even one from a man who had planned to end his life. Until he watched that video of Toby resting his forehead against a child lost in the dark. Tom read each line slowly, without rushing, without skipping a word. Sometimes he paused, a faint smile lifting the corner of his lips. Other times he simply ran his fingers across the paper as though trying to hear the echoes hiding beneath each stroke of ink. One letter made him stop longer than the rest. The handwriting was slanted, leaning to the left, likely from a teenage girl writing with her left hand. "I can't speak in front of a crowd. No one in class hears me clearly. But after I read about Toby, I started writing letters to myself every week, saying the things I couldn't say out loud. And I imagine that dog on the other end is listening." Tom took a breath, carefully folded the letter, and slipped it back into its envelope. He glanced at Toby, tilting his head with a quiet smile. "You hear even the words that never get spoken, don't you?" Toby didn't move, but the way his tail gave a small single wag, then stopped, made Tom smile and return slowly, like they had just shared something understood long ago, only now, finding the moment to say it. The sun tilted westward, and the golden light deepened, casting a honey-colored glow across the front yard like a soft memory. Tom stretched his legs, letters still in hand, and leaned back against the chair. A breeze slipped under the porch roof, carrying the scent of young grass and a trace of dusty road from somewhere far away. In that air, he whispered, not quite to Toby, not quite to himself. You don't just listen. You hold on to what the world forgot to keep. So many moments pass in a life where all we wish for is someone with the patience to simply listen. A cry for help cut off halfway, a sigh into the night, a glance lost in a crowd. And somehow, Toby was always the one creature quiet enough to catch those things and keep them like treasures. Without judgment, without needing anything in return. Tom had witnessed countless rescues, interviews, thank you speeches. But perhaps the reason he kept coming back each afternoon was that familiar shape curled beside the porch. The way Toby didn't need to go anywhere yet was always there, for everything left unsaid. As night settled, the town grew quiet. One by one, the streetlights flicked on a dotted line of brightness stretching across memory. Tom stood up, gathered the letters, and placed them in a small wooden box beside the chair. He turned to Toby, crouched to gently touch that warm, steady spine. Shall we read a few more tomorrow? Toby lifted his head. This time his tail wagged twice quicker than usual. And under the dim porch light, that tiny motion felt like an answer, big enough to fill the entire day. Tom said nothing more. He just sat back down beside his dog, beneath the spring wind, among the words that never found voices, but still floated quietly beneath the porch roof. At the edge of the yard, Lila had once written a line in chalk. Some things are only heard by Toby, now that chalk had faded under rain and sun. But beneath the stone tiles, one creature still lay there, morning after morning, evening after evening, silently remembering all the things never spoken aloud and holding them safe like a library of what the world thought it had lost. Toby, a dog who never needed training to be great. He only needed to be trusted. And once he was, he carried lives, spirits, and memories for others. Perhaps in this noisy, rushing world, what we truly need isn't a louder voice, but a quiet soul who will stay beside us when we're at our weakest. Toby's story, this German shepherd who seemed like just another service dog, opened up a deeper truth that listening doesn't always require words, and love never needs a condition. German shepherds have long been known for their intelligence, loyalty, and courage, but beyond obedience and task. Toby proved that the greatest part of any being isn't in applause or medals. It's in the quiet companionship offered even when no one remembers how to speak. This story is a reminder to look again at the four-legged lives around us, not merely as pets, but as true companions with hearts large enough to carry the unspoken wounds we don't yet know how to share. And if one day you ever feel alone, please remember somewhere there's a dog waiting for you. No questions, no judgment, just ready to be near. Because some miracles don't arrive with fanfare. They come with a gentle gaze and two ears always tilted forward as if saying, I'm here, just to listen. And sometimes love is nothing more than staying with someone in silence.